You must be fucking joking. Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. So today, this one has been inspired by listening to a podcast by my friend Amy McGrath Hughes over in the States. She's got a brilliant Squeeze podcast called Cool for Cats, and she has various guests on. I've been a guest on the show myself. The episode that I listened to yesterday while out walking the dog was focusing on this album, Squeeze Cozy Fan Tutti Frutti. She was having a wonderful conversation with a Squeeze fan called Dan Rivkin, and they got talking about this album for a long time. It was extremely interesting, and they were just talking about the fact that Squeeze basically disowned this album. This is the record that came out after they reformed in 1985 with Jules Holland back in the band. They recruited Paul Young's producer Laurie Latham and just really layered on the synthesizers and the mid-1980s production, and within a year of this album coming out, it wasn't a big hit. The band were basically dismissing it, and Glenn Tilbrook in particular I think was incredibly scathing about it. They do continue to play a couple of songs live from the record, and in fact till this day in recent times they've started playing the song Big Bang, which is the first song from this album. They've rearranged it and made it sound more contemporary. But for a long time, this album, Squeeze basically did disown it. And in the podcast, Amy and Dan were just discussing how interesting it is when bands disown an album despite having apparently signed off on it completely. You know, this record is an example of an album where nobody forced the band to do what they did. Nobody, you know, I don't think A&M told them to produce it in this style. They were quite happy to do it. Glenn Tilbrook apparently was, you know, all guns blazing in the studio. He was absolutely happy to do it, and even some of the demos that he'd made for the record showed that even before Laurie Latham got his hands on it, the songs were still shaping up to be what they were, which is very 1980s sounding, shall we say. So it's interesting the way that bands can really go to town making an album, just doing everything that they feel is right, and then within a matter of months they just basically just think, yeah, that was a total mistake. I mean, sometimes obviously it's down to the financial success or otherwise of said record. We'll get onto that a bit later in the video. But thought it'd be fun to see if I could find some other examples of records that were disowned by their creators. So I'll show a few, and then if people want to jump on the thread, if it becomes a thread, might not become a thread, we'll see. So so Squeeze took me straight away in my mind to Elvis Costello and the Attractions, and this record, a copy I picked up from Oxfam not so long ago. Somebody's made a very ill-guided attempt there to disguise where the stickers come off. This is Goodbye Cruel World. Now, this one did spring to mind because my memory is telling me that when it came out, I think it was the CD release when it came out years later, Elvis made sure that a sticker was affixed to the front of the CD saying something like, you know, congratulations Elvis Costello and the Attractions fans, you've just bought our worst album. Now, I don't know whether he still thinks it's their worst album. This is a case of an artist coming off the back of a long string of very good albums. You know, Costello had that run of records from 77, My Aim Is True, really all the way through, at least, you know, 4 or 5, 6 records, and a little bit like Elton John in the 1970s, Stevie Wonder in the 1970s. Sooner or later, inspiration does start to wear thin a little bit. Now, this record was the second album to be produced by the hit-making team of Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley, who were famous for having produced Madness, Voice of the Beehive, various other bands. Costello had teamed up with them on the previous record, Punch the Clock, to try and get a more pop sound going. Now, that record is not always universally revered by Costello fans, but it does have a couple of very big tunes on it. It's got Shipbuilding on it. It's got Every Day I Write the Book on it, you know, really big pop tunes. And the production does work, really. Now, what went wrong with this record, as far as Costello is concerned, is that he kept giving the producers, Clive and Alan, conflicting instructions in the studio. He couldn't make up his mind how he wanted these songs to go, whether they were going to be big production numbers, whether they were going to be raw guitar sounds, and he just kept vacillating, going back and between. Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley were not very impressed with the material that he brought to the sessions anyway, although Costello himself always said that he really liked the material on this record. He just didn't like the way it was realised. So it pales really in comparison to some of his other records, because you can kind of see that he's casting about for direction in a way. Having said that, it's not a terrible album by any stretch of the imagination. It's got some good stuff on it. You know, it launches side one with The Only Flame in Town, which is a bit of a Costello classic really. It's got The Comedians on side two, The Deportees Club, Peace in Our Time. It's not a bad record, but it's definitely one which Elvis, you know, within a few months of it coming out, he clearly regretted the creative decisions he'd made in the studio. Did he totally disown it? I don't know. Maybe not, maybe not. I thought that had to go in. Now this next one was completely disowned, I think, by its owner, by its creator. This is Ian Hunter and the album All American Alien Boy. So this was his second solo album. Ian Hunter obviously Mott the Hoople. And with this record, it was recorded at Electric Ladyland Studios, January 1976, and it had a bit of an all-star cast. He got in Ainsley Dunbar on drums, who was a very big session guy at the time, and also Jaco Pastorius on bass, really heavy league people. And also he had three members of Queen. He had Freddie Mercury, Brian May and Roger Taylor doing backing vocals on the song You Nearly Did Me In on side two. This is, I think it was just after Queen had become huge, and you know, he'd been friends with them for a long time. Queen had supported Mott the Hoople on the 1974 tour of the UK and America, so he called in that favour, really went to town on this record, tried to get maybe a bit more a jazzier sound because of Jaco's bass playing. But also he wrote a lot of quite slow anthemic songs. It's a little bit Bruce Springsteen-y on occasion. Now, after the record came out, it flopped completely commercially, and Ian Hunter was extremely condemnatory in what he had to say about it. So just going to refer to this book by John van der Kiest. This is Mott the Hoople and Ian Hunter in the 1970s from the Sonic Bond Decade series. This is what Ian had to say about All American Alien Boy. So John says, having been so enthusiastic about the album on its completion, Ian had second thoughts, later dubbing it a commercial suicide. Though first-class musicians were playing on it, he thought, and this was a quote now, it was all slow and pretty boring, but it was just something I wanted to do. So he wasn't very impressed with it. It's not a very hooky album, doesn't really hook you in the way that those great Mott the Hoople hits do. I don't think it's a great album. It has its moments, and the Queen song kind of makes it worthwhile having. Great cover, maybe not a fantastic record, but certainly one that Ian pretty much disowned after it came out, really. So there we go. All American Boy. And a similar artist, I guess, from a similar period in British pop music. This is Steve Harley from Cockney Rebel. Okay, so his first solo album, Hobo with a Grin. Now, Steve Harley was notoriously contrary. He was very career driven, but he had a sort of self-sabotaging nature. You know, he split up the first incarnation of Cockney Rebel, put the band back together again, never quite the same, split the band up again. And in the late 70s, he decided he was going to relocate to America, bought a home in Beverly Hills, recorded this record. I think part of it was recorded at Abbey Road, and then part of it was recorded in LA. And again, there's a few quite big heavy hitters on this record. You've got Bill Payne from Little Feat on keyboards. You've got Joe Partridge, who was quite a big guitarist at the time. Michael McDonald on backing vocals. Mark Bolan plays guitar on America the Brave. So he clearly went to town on the record, clearly wanted it to be something very big. And it wasn't very successful commercially. There's that story again. It cost £70,000 to make. And so he was quoted, I think, the following year. So the album came out in 1978. And by 1979, he was saying the following words about it. So he described the album as laid-back Californian stuff. It had no guts. I hated it. For the first time in my life, I relinquished responsibility, listened to advice, and acted on it rather than do what I thought was right. And then in a separate interview, he described the album as trash and said, I can't bear to listen to it. It's the worst thing I've ever done. I just want to forget about it. So fairly unambiguous condemnation from Steve there. Now interestingly, in later years, in 2020, he was interviewed again, and this time he said that the album was interesting with some really good moments on it. So there's an example, I guess, of how time can blunt the edges of some of this dislike, and an artist may really hate an album once it comes out, particularly if it's flopped really badly, but then further down the line they get things in focus a little bit and realise it's not actually all that bad. I really enjoy this record. It's not wonderful all the way through, but it's got some cracking stuff on it. The final couple of songs are really good. I Don't Believe God Is an Anarchist and Faith, Hope and Charity, both excellent cuts. The album has got a kind of slightly sleazy American sound to it, a little bit funky in places. It's got some great analog synths on it, and on the classic red EMI label. Yeah, I don't think nearly as bad as Steve made it out to be, but another good example of an artist, at the time anyway, disowning a record. Right, I'll whip through this one quite quickly. This is one that people will know about. Kiss Unmasked came right at the end of their makeup years. Not the only album that they disowned by themselves. The album after this, The Elder, they disowned possibly even more. And really this was a case of just the band running out of steam, really, starting to see their ticket sales tapering off, record sales tapering off. People have got a bit tired of the makeup. They famously tried to do a thing, tried to play on the idea of them being unmasked on this record, but it didn't really hit the spot. A couple of years later, they actually took the makeup off for the Lick It Up album. And of course, that made a huge splash, and that was a really big album. Now, would I choose to listen to Lick It Up or Unmasked? No competition. I would go for Unmasked every time. Kiss went very hair metal in the 80s. This record is just basically kind of just power pop, really. There's nothing too special about it, but it's just a pop album. Yes, they've lost their guts. Yes, they've lost their heart. But they're bringing in outside writers. There's a couple of quite fun tracks. It's got She's So European on it, Torpedo Girl. Ace Frehley's stuff on this record is really good, but I mean, after the album came out, I'm not sure even if Peter Criss played on it, or maybe it was Ace Frehley who didn't. I mean, the band was falling apart, and the group totally dismissed it after the event, and they kind of reacted against it and went into a much more metallic part of their career. Kiss were never a metal band really, but they got a bee in their bonnet, I think, after this record. They thought they popped out their trousers too much, so wanted to go into a more, hair metal direction, and I didn't find that particularly conducive to my ears, really. Right, two more. Now, I wanted to talk about Queen disowning an album. Now, you might think, so the first album that springs to your mind is, but I'm not going to talk about that one. I'm going to talk about this one. This is Jazz from 1978. Now, to be fair, I don't think Queen totally disowned this record, but they were definitely very disappointed with it. So this came off the back of the album News of the World, which had been a big hit in America. I think it was top 5 in America. But the band was starting to show signs of exhaustion, and they wanted to team up again with Roy Thomas Baker, their producer, who'd done all their big famous albums, Sheer Heart Attack, Night at the Opera. He'd been working with the Cars in recent times. He produced the first Cars album. That had been very successful, had a very lean, mean, stripped back kind of new wave sound. So Queen figured, okay, let's go back with Roy. But for one reason or another, it didn't really catch spark. Maybe one of the reasons was they were lacking the engineering skills of their longtime engineer Mike Stone, who hadn't been available to go out to Montserrat and France, where the album was recorded. This is the first Queen album not to be recorded in England. At this point, they were tax exiles. They went out to France and to Montserrat to do the album, and I don't think they really found what they were looking for. The sound that they got in the studio was quite brittle. There was something clinical about it, and something that just didn't pack a punch. Roger's drums in particular just didn't quite have the necessary amount of thunder. Brian and Roger were quite scathing about the record after the event. Roger in particular totally dismissed his 2 tracks on the record. He totally dismissed more of that jazz and fun it. He said he didn't like them at all. Brian May pretty much dismissed Fat Bottom Girls, although he was a fan of Dead on Time, which was the a really fast-paced rocker on side 2. Neither of John Deacon's songs are particularly special. Freddie's stuff is good. You've got Bicycle Race, and I suppose the big song is Don't Stop Me Now. But interestingly, at the time, Don't Stop Me Now was not particularly rated within the band, and in fact, this is an amazing fact, Don't Stop Me Now did not survive in Queen's setlist longer than 1 year after this record came out. It was played for the last time, I think, right at the end of 1979. It was only years later that that song became a big famous hit, but I mean, you won't see it being performed at Queen Live at Wembley. It wasn't performed at Live Aid, so it was almost a sort of posthumous success, that song. At the time, it really wasn't viewed inside the band as being anything special. I don't think they liked this album very much, and maybe they didn't totally disown it, but after this they went with Mac at Musicland and changed direction really, and got much more of a spring in their step. And to finish, we'll go with this one. This is the big granddaddy of them all, Pink Floyd, Atom Heart Mother, and this was the orchestral album they made in 1970 with the avant-garde classical composer Ron Geesin, and years later, I think it was maybe in the 90s, somebody asked Roger Waters, would he ever consider performing Atom Heart Mother again, and he said, his quote was, "You must be fucking joking." And I don't think any of the band were pleased with it. I think they saw it as being a diversion, really. I think they saw Meddle as being a step towards Dark Side of the Moon. This album comes from the interim period, between Syd Barrett leaving and them starting to get their shit together. You've got Atom Heart Mother, which is a kind of orchestral conceit with a male and female voice choir, very long drawn out passages. It's a nice album. I do like it, and interestingly, Roger has not totally disowned side 2 of the record, because I know he still plays the song If in concert. Got a feeling that David Gilmour plays Fat Old Son in concert as well, and those songs sound much better with a modern production style. This album is just not very well recorded. I don't know why. I think it was self-produced. It was done at Abbey Road Studios, I think, but it just doesn't have a very incisive sound. It's a bit muddy, and the orchestral stuff and the choral stuff kind of doesn't quite gel, really. Floyd themselves said that just the way that they put it together, the way it was put together, it just didn't quite work. So essentially, they view it now really as almost not part of the canon. Even though it was a big album, it was a #1 album. I don't think they rate it at all. So in their minds, after this record, things got on track, and then they were on that clear path towards Dark Side of the Moon. But if you listen to this record, I think you can already hear pre-echoes of Dark Side of the Moon in this. I think it's the first time you start to hear David Gilmour's guitar sound coming through, and there are definitely some passages. Some of the lyrics on the Roger song If, you can definitely start to hear him inching forward, towards some of that lyrical territory that was going to be on Echoes on Atom Heart, on Meddle, and then on songs like Brain Damage on Dark Side of the Moon. You can kind of see it drifting into focus, but the band themselves, I don't think they necessarily saw it that way, and they were fairly dismissive of this record after the event. So there we go, those are my examples. So I'd love to know if there are any more examples. I do know of a few other ones, but I don't own the records, so it'd be interesting to see what people think, if you can come up with any other suggestions, maybe ones I haven't thought of, but those are mine anyway. So hope I didn't balls anything up there and get anything wrong. I'm sure I did, because I always do. Anyway, that's it. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I shall see you all soon. Take care, bye bye.